voting moment now. The president will speak about last night's missile attack on 2 American military bases by, of course, the Iranian government. There were no casualties from that attack, which is reported to have been the intention of the Iranian government. Both the foreign minister and Ayatollah have said there are no further plans for additional military action as long as the president does not respond.
So here with their thoughts on what the president might say, Democratic strategist, friend of the show, Roger Fisk, and the Hill's White House columnist, Niall Stanage. Welcome, gentlemen. It's great to see you.
Good morning.
Thanks,
So
guys.
obviously we're anxiously awaiting, and we'll break to the president's coverage as soon as that happens. Roger, we have a live shot there of the podium. I believe that's in the East Room. The president's assembled, and so 2 teleprompters, prepared remarks. What do we expect to hear from the president, Roger? And what is it like in the back room, so to speak, before an address like this, as you're making last-minute changes to the address?
I think they're most likely have all the stakeholders in the room, from the various defense agencies, state, national security advisor, and things like that. And I think their goal for today is to try to consolidate and simplify after the last 72 hours of a bunch of different messages flying out in a bunch of different ways. You have the status of forces memo that got out somehow and that caused confusion. You have the president saying one thing about cultural sites, and then his Secretary of State and the counselor to the president go out and try to spin that as something he did not say, and then he turned around on Air Force One and says that it is something that he intends to do. So I think if there's anything, what the president wants to do is go out there and send a clear signal to the American people about what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we measure success, and that he's going to do his utmost to protect American interests around the world. That, I would imagine, in this administration, or at least any other administration, is going to be the goal of the morning.
Yeah.
And now we saw a tweet from the president last night. That's the only information we have, where he said all is well. And it seemed to indicate that he did not plan to escalate further. We've got that tweet up here. All is well. Assessments of casualties and damages so far so good, et cetera, et cetera. Bizarre tweet, let's just say. But I think a lot of us breathed a sigh of relief that it seemed like he was not going to go through with hitting the 52 sites that had been identified. He was not going to further ratchet up the tensions. But you never know with this president. What do you think we might hear out of him this
Well,
today?
I think your point, Crystal, we never know with this president is the crucial thing. It's almost always a fool's errand to predict what this president is going to do.
Fair.
It's true.
You said about a relief about him not going after the sites. That's true. I think a lot of people were relieved that he did not address the nation last night, which had been rumoured at one stage, because people were worried about an intemperate response. I think Roger's point is correct. I think the real key thing to watch here is going to be, is there anything escalatory in these remarks, or does the president seem to be taking an off-ramp, sort of basically saying, well, we'll kind of leave it here? Is there going to be any taunting of the Iranians? Is there going to be any claim of a victory on the president's part? Those are, I think, the kind of key questions to look at.
And I covered the White House for over a year, and I remember sitting in the room and for some of the things like this. And it is interesting. The one area where their conventionality has been preserved, despite the tweets, whatever, it's actually in these addresses. There's a big formality to many of these things. And I think you're right, Roger, which is that this is the one area where the national security bureaucracy really does maintain over the speeches, over how things are done. The National Security Council has a process in place for this. I guess the real question is the big strategic ones. It's like, are we going to take the off-ramp? The Iranians have clearly offered us one. The president does not want war, it seems, and yet he killed Qasem Soleimani, one of the largest escalatory moves that we've seen in our relations with the Iranians for some time. And there isn't a lot of strategic coherence behind those decisions. Do you think he's going to come back to his roots? Because at his core, he has not really been somebody who says he wants to escalate, but then has also deferred much of his administration to people who want war with Iran.
Yeah, I mean, his words have been isolationist, but a lot of the folks that he's hired have been interventionists,
yes.
Right? So, like, the layers of cognitive dissonance throughout this are multiple. Most specifically, the first thing I thought when I saw that they had gone ahead with this strike was that it is trying to pound a square peg into a round hole in this sense, and we chatted about this a little bit this morning, which is Soleimani was not an intellectual leader or a spiritual leader. So it's not like some inspirational voice or someone who defined a vision for a movement has now been silenced. He was basically a military apparatchik. And militaries have continuity of operations and things like that. And lo and behold, they've already replaced him. His replacement has already been named. And his replacement is even more of a hardliner than he was.
Yeah, right.
So if you grant the idea that there were plans and designs to do damage to Americans, no one should be taking any comfort in the idea that somehow the removal of this one individual results in those plans or designs evaporating.
Yeah,
that's-
and Niall, this president seems to be very influenced by whoever has his ear at the moment. So who are the voices in the administration right now who seem to have his ear, and what ultimately is their agenda? Are we, in fact, in a place where the agenda, the official administration agenda, is ending with a goal of regime change in Iran?
I'm not sure if it's going as far as regime change, but certainly someone like Mike Pompeo is someone who is close to the president, has been very hawkish. And one of the interesting things about Pompeo is he's someone who has been particularly focused on the idea of embassy security. And of course, the attack or the protest recently at the embassy in Baghdad were, in a sense, the spark that produced the current crisis. So Pompeo is someone who has been, as I say, hawkish on that subject, but also someone who has been very keen to limit or minimise the amount of distance between him and the president. I think Roger is quite right. It's difficult for people around the president to quite navigate these currents between isolationism and interventionism, the desire for America to appear strong, to appear muscular in pushing back, and at the same time the president having this reluctance to be sucked into endless wars of the type that we have seen in recent years.
Right, because there's two competing instincts here, right? There's the instinct to be against whatever Obama did. And so this perception that, Obama was weak with Iran, Obama was weak in the Middle East, he was weak with this deal. There's the instinct to do the opposite, whatever you think the opposite of him is. And then there's the instinct to withdraw from overseas, to follow through on some of the campaign pledges that he made that were very impactful for his voters. I mean, when he stood on the stage and went after Jeb Bush for the Iraq war, that was kind of a watershed moment for the Republican Party. So you kind of have these two competing instincts that seem to exist within this president.
Yeah, I mean, look, to just go to the next layer of detail within that point, look at, he's said no more endless wars. We want to bring our troops home. And then the Iraqi government votes to, or at least expresses a resolution such that we would like American troops to leave Iraq. And his first response is, well, we're not leaving. Right. So very little of, in my analysis of what he does or how he behaves and the decisions he makes are necessarily based on any kind of principle or any kind of North Star in terms of a morality that would inform foreign policy, whether or not you even agree with it. But it more seems to be situational and transactional and responding to circumstances in a way that is more kind of a temporary, fleeting, ego kind of self-bomb that he applies to himself, rather than having it be some product of a larger design.
That's the thing about Iraq. It's complicated, right? Which is that, okay, the Obama administration pulled out of Iraq. They listened when the Iranian-dominated Shia government said, get out. They said, okay, and they left. They didn't renew the Status of Forces Agreement. Well, what ended up happening? Rise of ISIS, the Sunnis, it's a disaster, Kurdistan, Syria, etc. So it's like, we're screwed no matter what happens here. And I think that's what, anytime we talk about this, I just feel like the sense of fatalism, which is like, okay, you leave, it's going to be bad. If you stay, it's going to be bad. People are going to die. And a lot of the escalation, I mean, that we see is it's not oriented towards a strategic goal, and that's actually what really worries me. I think this was semi-true under the Obama administration as well, which is that ultimately, I mean, we are still on a war footing with Iran. And I don't know if there's any possibility of changing that now, because in the Iranian regime itself, there's also a desire for war with the United States. Maybe rightfully so, based upon many, many years, I think, on our side. And so it's like we're caught in this 40-year kind of struggle. and there doesn't seem to be desire from either side in order to do anything about it.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I also think to the point that you made just before that, there's a question that sometimes gets raised in very sort of weighty or earnest magazine articles. What's the Trump doctrine, right? Is there one? No. I mean, it's not clear to me that there is one at all. There is instinct. There's the kind of transactional approach that Roger was referring to. When the Iraq Parliament passed that resolution, one of the president's first responses was, "We're not leaving until they pay us back for building an airbase," right? That is not the kind of grasp of the nuances or the sophistication of things either in Iraq or Iran that provides an obvious way forward or that enables allies or adversaries to predict what the president is going to do next. Now, his supporters would say that can be an asset. It can, but it also greatly raises the risks of things going wrong.
It's like when you ask about the Trump doctrine was the guy in 2016 who understood that all these people who spoke well had driven the country into a horrific war and situation, but then came into power and more has deferred to some of the worst actors, right, Roger?
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that he brought Bolton into his administration at all should have blown people's minds, given some of the rhetoric from the campaign trail.
It's
and how he didn't end up wearing some of the Bush criticisms that, as you mentioned a couple minutes ago. I took Crystal's earlier point and dug a little deeper into that, so I'm going to take your most recent point and dig a little deeper into that. It's not 40 years, it's thousands of years in a lot of ways, depending how you think of it, but at least 100 years. 100 years ago, the Treaty of Versailles had just been passed, and the Treaty of Versailles is the midwife for Iraq and Syria.
That's a good point.
So a lot of the problems that we're having are our addiction to oil, but B, we have superimposed a set of boundaries and maps onto the Middle East that are very top-down. They don't reflect routes of commerce, religious divides, all these different things. We basically took the Middle East and cut a 50-yard line through it, and for a while it was the British influence zone and the French influence zone, and then we parceled it out from there. The indiscriminate borders that we drew as a result, and in the aftermath of World War I, set in motion a lot of these conflicts. For example, the British government endorsed Palestinian statehood in, I think, 1919 or 1920, without necessarily defining where that should be. So then that sets in motion a whole chain of events for decades. And then even more recently, in the course of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, President Reagan was publicly arming and training Saddam Hussein. We know how that kind of turned out a couple decades later, while at the same time we find out that the White House is also selling 1,500 TOW missiles to Iran.
Right.
So the idea that we're walking around there and we're sitting atop some deep well of credibility is probably the first mistake that people make, because we have been double dealing and duplicitous over there for a long, long time, and a lot of our actions have been much more top down with a strong whiff of imperialism about it than it is about necessarily working with the communities from the bottom up to create an economic system and a set of boundaries that truly reflect how people are living their lives.
And if I can just jump in there, I mean, I think that's a great point that also permeates media coverage of a lot of these conflicts or tensions. To me, a lot of the time, the assumption is that people will think that the United States is operating out of honourable intentions, that is just a default, or that's assumed. And in Iran, for example, that's not at all assumed, not only because of US support for the Shah, but about the coup, the rid of Mossadegh, things of that nature that are comparatively recent history, and I think call into question American motivations a lot of the time.
And just to build on that, because within this, there's many missed opportunities. And we need to remember, and maybe remind some folks that might not remember, that in the aftermath of 9/11, tens of thousands of people marched in support of the United States of America in the streets of Tehran when it was difficult to do so.
Sunni terrorism.
Right. Yeah. And the Sunni Shia thing is an extremely interesting conversation as well. People don't know that it goes back ultimately to the fact that Muhammad didn't have a male heir, and that sets in motion that whole thing. But there are peeking around the drapes of this situation is an opportunity, which is Iran has a thriving middle class. And I subscribe to the idea that anytime a middle class, as soon as it starts to manifest and people get more information and can have more control over their lives, inexorably puts them on a march towards the Western liberal democratic experiment. I believe that. So a middle class in Iran should be something that we welcome and something that we're reaching out to and trying to cultivate a relationship with. And I don't think that there's the appetite or the aptitude when it comes to diplomacy on the part of this particular crew in the White House right now that looks upon that as a viable place or a legitimate place to spend energy and resources.
I'm not sure I agree with that, but I think
I don't want to ignore the Democrats' role here in just allowing President Trump to have unchecked powers. I mean, progressives had offered amendments to try to constrain what he would be able to do in the region. The leadership, in order to appease Republicans, stripped those down, and now we are where we are. CNN has just released images of the damage to our air bases. I don't know if we have those that we could put up. Those will be up in just a moment. But now let me also ask you, just coming back to this president, the way he approaches these things, what he's thinking about. Lindsey Graham, who's been a great ally of this president, was on with Sean Hannity last night and said that Iran, I'm paraphrasing, better be careful or else they're going to find themselves no longer in the oil business, basically indicating we could attack their oil production facilities. Does Lindsey Graham have a lot of influence with this president? Who is this president listening to in terms of outside of the immediate administration circles? Who's most influential in that outer circle?
Sometimes I question the framing of a question like that about influence. Do people have influence to get the president to change direction?
Right.
Or does their influence derive from a kind of loyalty to him under all circumstances? Because I've seen even this morning Senator Graham and Senator Mike Lee both making more conciliatory noises than Republicans have been making in the past couple of days, suggesting that maybe the off-ramp that Sagar was talking about should be taken. So it seems to me that oftentimes the Republican Party or the president's allies try to sort of form their ranks around what they expect him to do rather than actually alter the course of where
You might
he's headed.
call that behavior sycophantic.
You
I
might,
believe would be the word
absolutely.
there.
I'm checking now. I don't see yet. We have not yet received a 2-minute warning from the White House. Still waiting on that. Looking here at some of the live satellite images of the damage at Al Asad Air Base. Obviously, we don't know what is in there. We can generally assume. I mean, it does look, Roger. I mean, there's some building damage in the top, and then on the top right, there's also that building that was struck. So one thing that I wanted to point out, I mean, we're obviously speculating to motive, is that ballistic missiles are actually much more precise weapons than the rockets that these militias usually use, which means actually that there was a high level or a much higher level of precision with this attack than normal. So we could generally assume that these ballistic missiles were intentionally pointed towards places where the Iranians knew that American personnel and Iraqi personnel were not going to be. What does that tell you as an analyst from that situation?
Exactly that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we can all agree that we want to be somewhat restrained until we have a more robust set of information ahead
we don't know. Again,
in front of us to know exactly what it is we're talking about. I mean, if you're in this day and age with most of these missile systems, it's just as easy to fire 40 as it is to fire 4. Right. So my initial reaction to that is it looks like it's more a mosquito bite to try to kind of annoy the U.S. It seems to me that had they wanted to kind of level that situation, that if 3 or 4 can get in there, then 6 or 8 or 10 can get in there. So I would imagine that this more falls into the kind of chess move and is more kind of a signal that there are vulnerabilities and that things can slip through whatever our defenses are over there. Because based on that, it was, at least on that picture, there was only about 5 or 10% of the footprint of that base that was impacted.
Right.
Niall, what do you believe is the ultimate goal of this administration? I mean, where do we go from here? If we assume correctly that the president doesn't want to escalate from here, that he doesn't want to target further Iranian sites or individuals, what does happen next? Where do we go from here?
Well, one of my main criticisms of this administration is that its objectives, in my view, are often about appearance rather than substance. I think the objective of this administration with respect to Iran is to appear strong. In an odd way, that could be a silver lining to the circumstance we're in right now. I think it's plausible that the president comes out and claims a victory of a kind, reiterates his case for the initial drone strike that escalated all this, and lets things sort of evolve in a fairly calm way from there, as someone who has stood up, as he would see it, to Iranian meddling. I don't really think that he is instinctively disposed toward a ground war or something of that nature.
Just sorry to cut you off there. I believe the President of the United States there emerging with his national security team. Let's go live. I think it's the grand foyer of the White House. He's flanked there by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Vice President, Secretary of Defense, a lot of other members of the U.S. military. I guess I'm not sure. I thought I saw the president in there, but he's
on the left.
He's coming. The Secretary of Defense
is on the right.
Let's name everybody we can in there in order to fill some time.
General Milley's at the back from Boston, Massachusetts, by the way.
Yeah. So I mistakenly said this was the East Room. I've actually never seen an event in the grand foyer. In the grand foyer.
And do we expect, Roger? Do we expect press to get any questions here? Or is this just going to be a prepared statement and then out? Niall, do you have any sense?
No, it would be better. I would imagine that the staff's plan is probably that he does not take questions. Yeah. But then, as we know,
I can tell you, as a former White House correspondent, what we would always look for. One bad sign is that you see that there are officials of both parties in the front row. Usually, if that's the case, then it's a little bit harder for the president to see the reporters. So one of the just a behind the scenes thing, what you would try and do. The doors are opening now, and the president is coming. Let's listen in live to his remarks.
As long as I'm president of the United States, Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Good morning. I'm pleased to inform you the American people should be extremely grateful and happy. No Americans were harmed in last night's attack by the Iranian regime. We suffered no casualties. All of our soldiers are safe, and only minimal damage was sustained at our military bases. Our great American forces are prepared for anything. Iran appears to be standing down, which is a good thing for all parties concerned and a very good thing for the world. No American or Iraqi lives were lost because of the precautions taken, the dispersal of forces, and an early warning system that worked very well. I salute the incredible skill and courage of America's men and women in uniform. For far too long, all the way back to 1979 to be exact, nations have tolerated Iran's destructive and destabilizing behavior in the Middle East and beyond. Those days are over. Iran has been the leading sponsor of terrorism, and their pursuit of nuclear weapons threatens the civilized world. We will never let that happen. Last week, we took decisive action to stop a ruthless terrorist from threatening American lives. At my direction, the United States military eliminated the world's top terrorist, Qasem Soleimani. As the head of the Quds Force, Soleimani was personally responsible for some of the absolutely worst atrocities. He trained terrorist armies, including Hezbollah, launching terrorist strikes against civilian targets. He fueled bloody civil wars all across the region. He viciously wounded and murdered thousands of U.S. troops, including the planting of roadside bombs that maim and dismember their victims. Soleimani directed the recent attacks on U.S. personnel in Iraq that badly wounded 4 service members and killed 1 American, and he orchestrated the violent assault on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. In recent days, he was planning new attacks on American targets, but we stopped him. Soleimani's hands were drenched in both American and Iranian blood. He should have been terminated long ago. By removing Soleimani, we have sent a powerful message to terrorists. If you value your own life, you will not threaten the lives of our people. As we continue to evaluate options in response to Iranian aggression, the United States will immediately impose additional punishing economic sanctions on the Iranian regime. These powerful sanctions will remain until Iran changes its behavior. In recent months alone, Iran has seized ships in international waters, fired an unprovoked strike on Saudi Arabia, and shot down 2 U.S. drones. Iran's hostilities substantially increased after the foolish Iran nuclear deal was signed in 2013, and they were given $150 billion, not to mention $1.8 billion in cash. Instead of saying thank you to the United States, they chanted death to America. In fact, they chanted death to America the day the agreement was signed. Then Iran went on a terror spree, funded by the money from the deal, and created hell in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The missiles fired last night at us and our allies were paid for with the funds made available by the last administration. The regime also greatly tightened the reins on their own country, even recently killing 1,500 people at the many protests that are taking place all throughout Iran. The very defective JCPOA expires shortly anyway and gives Iran a clear and quick path to nuclear breakout. Iran must abandon its nuclear ambitions and end its support for terrorism. The time has come for the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Russia, and China to recognize this reality. They must now break away from the remnants of the Iran deal, or JCPOA. And we must all work together toward making a deal with Iran that makes the world a safer and more peaceful place. We must also make a deal that allows Iran to thrive and prosper and take advantage of its enormous untapped potential. Iran can be a great country. Peace and stability cannot prevail in the Middle East as long as Iran continues to foment violence, unrest, hatred, and war. The civilized world must send a clear and unified message to the Iranian regime. Your campaign of terror, murder, mayhem will not be tolerated any longer. It will not be allowed to go forward. Today, I am going to ask NATO to become much more involved in the Middle East process. Over the last 3 years, under my leadership, our economy is stronger than ever before, and America has achieved energy independence. These historic accomplishments change our strategic priorities. These are accomplishments that nobody thought were possible. And options in the Middle East became available. We are now the #1 producer of oil and natural gas anywhere in the world. We are independent, and we do not need Middle East oil. The American military has been completely rebuilt under my administration at a cost of $2.5 trillion. U.S. armed forces are stronger than ever before. Our missiles are big, powerful, accurate, lethal, and fast. Under construction are many hypersonic missiles. The fact that we have this great military and equipment, however, does not mean we have to use it. We do not want to use it. American strength, both military and economic, is the best deterrent. 3 months ago, after destroying 100% of ISIS and its territorial caliphate, we killed the savage leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, who was responsible for so much death, including the mass beheadings of Christians, Muslims, and all who stood in his way. He was a monster. Al-Baghdadi was trying again to rebuild the ISIS caliphate and failed. Tens of thousands of ISIS fighters have been killed or captured during my administration. ISIS is a natural enemy of Iran. The destruction of ISIS is good for Iran, and we should work together on this and other shared priorities. Finally, to the people and leaders of Iran, we want you to have a future, and a great future, one that you deserve, one of prosperity at home and harmony with the nations of the world. The United States is ready to embrace peace with all who seek it. I want to thank you, and God bless America. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, you've been listening there, of course, the President of the United States reacting to those Iranian missile strikes on 2 American bases in Iraq. Some of the top line takeaways here. First of all, he started off by saying, while he is president, Iran will not achieve a nuclear weapon. He emphasized that there are no casualties, either American or Iraqi. Added that there will be additional economic sanctions. So that seems to be the response. Of course, we already have brutal sanctions in place on Iran. There isn't a whole lot further we can go in that regard. And to me, Roger, I'll start with you. This was both, there was some tough language there, right? We will not allow, you cannot continue in this direction. We will stand against you in every way. And there was also some conciliatory language there, in particular at the end, talking about how, you know, we welcome peace-seeking people wherever they may be found. What were your top takeaways?
The fundamental misunderstanding of the nuclear deal is a pervasive theme with the president. The idea that there was money given to, or how he knows what funding went into what operations or weapons is beyond me. I don't know how he can necessarily determine that. It's important that folks understand that the money that was given in the course of the Iran deal getting done were assets that had been frozen in one bucket, and the other bucket was an arms deal that we'd made with Iran in 1979, where we got paid for the arms and never delivered them. So these were basically outstanding debts, and if you're going to freeze the assets of a regime that you think is evil, at some point those become unfrozen unless you want to break more international laws. I do at the same time want to say that I welcome, it's interesting, I welcome when he is restrained and measured, but at the same time I can feel kind of a turbulence under the surface for him because that is such an unnatural environment for him. I feel like when he's reading something like that you can just feel him wanting to kind of burst through that written word and kind of say exactly what's on his mind. So I don't think that role, it's interesting, I don't think that role necessarily sits well with him, but me as an American, as an observer, at the same time welcomes, you know, a couple coherent sentences that speak to relatively sober national interests. So I'm somewhat conflicted when I hear him say that, just as he seems conflicted when he's saying it.
There's one cause for optimism here. He said, we will evaluate future options, and the only concrete thing he said was economic sanctions. That means, for now, no military response to Iran. A lot of that language, tough military background, General Miley sitting in the background, was meant to convey, hey, we've got, I think he said we've got, you know, fast lethal weapons and hypersonic missiles, don't want to use them. For now, this is what we're going to be doing. The other thing that caught my eye, Niall, was talking about NATO. He said the United States wants to bring NATO to become more involved in the Middle East, made a specific and actually correct point that we are an energy independent nation at this point, and the U.S. does not need Middle Eastern oil, despite the fact that we pay for the defense of much of it in the Straits of Hormuz and throughout the Middle East writ large. So you have kind of a mixing of, you know, the Trump original instinct, which is to get the international community to step up for its own interests, a lessening, hopefully, of tensions right here on economic sanctions. What did you make of some of that?
I think those are both great points, and I think it's really important. The first point you raised about him not threatening a direct military response. To me, that's what everyone was looking at, and we didn't hear that. What we heard was a speech that was fairly conventional, coming from, a Republican president. This was something that you had mentioned in the lead-in to his remarks, how these kind of set pieces are often more conventional than other elements of his presidency. Yeah. So I thought the emphasis on sanctions, the emphasis that Iran should not get a nuclear weapon, yes, that's a somewhat hawkish position, I suppose, but it's not threatening that, we're about to press the button and we're going to, nuke Tehran or something, which was the danger, I think, that a lot of people saw.
Yeah, absolutely. Roger, the other piece here that he mentioned, he called on our European allies and China and Russia to walk away from JCPOA. I mean, how are our European allies viewing this speech right now?
Well, it's interesting. NATO, to me, feels like that kind of neglected plant that has been needing water for 3 years. And then all of a sudden now, after the ridicule and after his public, very intentional distance creating between him and people like Merkel and Macron and things like that, all of a sudden now NATO is back in this relatively standard boilerplate language. The list of allies that we have now is still roughly the same, but the alliances themselves are much weaker. And that list could start with the Kurds. The fact of the matter is, no matter what he says and no matter how frustrated he is with this current situation, which is largely by his own design, Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon now than 3 years ago. And North Korea is closer to a nuclear weapon now than 3 years ago. So for all the bluster and for all the kind of chest thumping, the machinery of these programs, that's ostensibly what he is so concerned about, moves forward. But again, also separate his rhetoric, he still seems to think that the press statements and the photo ops drive policy, that somehow you just stand with Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il, or Un rather, and then somehow after that, somehow the photo op just results in the policy getting worked out. And I hope at some point these folks figure this out, because there's scant evidence that just the press release or just the optics are actually driving any diplomatic results.
My only counter to that will be North Korea did have a nuclear weapon 3 years ago. But one of the lessons I learned from North Korea was, if you really want a nuke, you're going to get it. If you want to starve, 20 million of your own people in exchange for getting a nuclear weapon, it's going to happen. And that is, and frankly, there's absent directly striking that reactor and going to a full-blown war, which includes chemical weapons, there ain't nothing you can do about it.
Well, and that's, but that goes into the Iranian calculus as well, because why did we feel at liberty to take out Soleimani? If they were a nuclear power at this point, do you think that we would have risked that?
Look, and you talk about NATO.
That's why they make that calculation.
I can't, part of the reason that I originally was enthused by Trump was his willingness to talk about NATO, to the people who knocked off Gaddafi, who gave up his nuclear weapons. And from what I told from people who have met with the North Koreans, every time that we say, hey, you have to give up their nukes, they're like, oh yeah, what happened to Gaddafi? Right. Look at Gaddafi. And they're not wrong, right?
No, because being a nuclear state is the key threshold for countries around the world, right? If you can get up over that, just like Pakistan, if you can get up over that, then you're up there in relatively rarefied air, and everyone else is down below.
And the Gaddafi example is not cited enough, I think, in media coverage of this, because I think that that's a lesson that was learnt across the region to a lot of people's detriment.
So now, what do you expect from here? I mean, Roger's initial point is so important that, okay, he read the speech from the teleprompter, he did the thing that his aides got him to do this morning, and then we find out later on what he really thinks about this, right? I mean, that's the other piece of this, is when he's watching the Fox News coverage, hanging out and, during his executive time, that's when we may, in some senses, get a better understanding of where things may go from here.
Yeah, and to me, the danger there is of him spiking the football in a more emphatic way than he just did in those remarks. To me, those remarks this morning were, as we've said, somewhat conventional. Of course, he's going to make his case. Of course, he's going to defend the killing of Soleimani. But he wasn't really crossing that other threshold to be really taunting the Iranians, in my opinion. If he does cross that threshold, then you could be back into the spiral that we have seen over the past weeks, where people are then expecting a response the danger of escalation, the danger of miscalculation all comes much more to the front.
Especially
Right,
when the
because-
Iranians have proven that they're willing to go right back at him on Twitter, right?
Well, and that's the
and compete on
issue,
that bandwidth
is,
where he.
to Niall's point, they have their own domestic political considerations,
Yes.
and they cannot afford to have this be seen as, what did you call it, a mosquito bite?
Yeah, mosquito
you know,
bite.
if the
We had an
Iranian
intelligence analyst this morning making that exact point, which is he was like, I hope Trump doesn't emphasize how bad how the attack was minuscule, because that will undercut the regime's message. We want the regime to
needs
think.
the people to
Yeah.
believe that this was proportionate to
Right.
killing one of their top officials.
Right. So it's very interesting in some of these dynamics, and it plays out in a whole bunch of different ways in life. But sometimes one of the smartest things you can do is let the other side say that they won and walk away.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe.
I don't think Trump's very good at that.
and it's to
No
Niall's point,
superpowers.
and the way you asked the question to him a
Yeah.
moment ago is, when is the private kind of grieving alone on the second floor of the White House Trump going to surface? And how much is he, as we saw with Charlottesville and a whole bunch of other things, there's the canned, very controlled, confined, statement that's clearly written by a team and things like that. And you can see him bristling under it, to my point of about 15 minutes ago. And then when the pendulum swings back and all the staff is gone and then he's alone and he sees the wrong interview from someone who's criticizing him, does that other side of him come out? And do you get into the spiking the football? And do you get into the taunting and things like that? Because like I said, the Iranians are willing to play ball on the social media taunting, and that's where things. I mean, this feels to me like we're much more towards the beginning of this, even if it just continues as a diplomatic tete-a-tete. I feel like we're much more towards the beginning of this, and that statement to me felt like he was trying to kind of punctuate something, as if we're at the end of it, and I think we're much more at the beginning.
We'll certainly see.
And
Well
I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, great to have your
Thank
both
you so
your
much for your
perspectives.
analysis.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
And thank you all for joining us. We'll be back with Rising tomorrow.